It's my pleasure today to introduce Christina Kramer. And as you just heard, she's a relatively new fellow of Senior College. And that's because she just recently retired from the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures here at the U of T. And I do want to begin by thanking her, by the way, for filling in at relatively short notice for a speaker from another university who chose, as many have, to postpone his talk because of the CAU censure of our university. Now, I've been thinking about how to introduce Christina, whom I've known for quite a while, and I realized I could introduce her as a musician, a very fine clarinetist, in fact, from a very musical family. I could introduce her as the eminent Balkan linguist that she is. She's the author of, among many other books and articles, a prize-winning Macedonian grammar textbook. And I say that because I think that's actually quite important for introducing her today for her talk. For this was no ordinary grammar book. It combined excessively presented but sophisticated linguistic theory with both text and important cultural information. And this struck me as very important because this means that students would learn how to understand, to speak, to read, to write Macedonian, while also learning about the culture's music, its health policies, housing, travel, work, family, recreation, you name it. So this is clearly someone who has thought a lot about language in context, language as it's embedded in society. And that, I think, is what you would expect a translator to think about, right? Literature, like language, never exists in a vacuum. Both are living, changing things, as deployed and understood by different people in different places at different times. Over the last while, Christina Kramer has become an award-winning translator of both Bulgarian and Macedonian fiction. In fact, I think I'm going to share my screen here for a moment. Okay, I want you to see the, I think, quite brilliant covers of her translations, and you might want to actually jot some titles down if you're interested. As you'll hear today, Christina has thought a lot about the process of translating. In one interview, she put, I think beautifully, the challenge and the joy of being a translator when she said, and I quote, "I get to be very creative inside a box that somebody else has built." And that box for her is usually fiction written in Macedonian, one of what she calls the oldest and the newest Slavic languages. I suspect she's going to tell us more about this today, but this language has a long and complex history of dialect differentiation. But as a literary language, it was only codified in the 1940s. So because it's a language with, in a way, a very old history and a very rich dialect base, it turns out that Macedonian literature is very varied and very experimental. And that's a large part of its appeal for her, I think. What else can I tell you about her? She's held several grants from the National Endowment for the Arts. Her translations have been included among notable works, as well as long listed for best translated work, including a prestigious Lois Roth Prize honorable mention. Her translations of short fiction and excerpts from the novels have been published in numerous, again, prestigious journals, including the Chicago Review, Modern Literature, World Literature Today, Words Without Borders, and many others. I'm going to stop sharing here and come back. One of the most creative people I know, Christina, not surprisingly, has found a wonderful image for the translator. She sees her role as that of a scrim or a screen that stands between two texts. To quote her from an interview, "And when the translations are really working, we don't see the scrim. The light shines through and we see the work of art uninterrupted. But sometimes you want there to be a little texture, so the viewer of this new work of art realizes that they're looking through something." So that balance, for me, she says, is a question of how transparent, how seamless do I want this screen to be between the reader and the experience of reading? If you want to hear more about this, please welcome Christina Kramer to talk to us today on lines of labor, sound and sense in literary translation. Welcome, Christina.
Thank you very much. That was a great introduction, and I'm really glad I rewrote my papers. So you're not going to hear any of those. You're going to hear some of those things, but not those particular things. One of my COVID projects was to build a a website to feature these writers. And I'm just going to type it into the chat if anyone is interested in looking at any of information about these novels or these writers. I'm just going to put this in, and then I will, we all need COVID projects. There you go. And I'm going to start, and I'm actually going to read this, and I hope I read it at a tempo that one isn't boring and the other is at a rate that you can understand. I opted against slides because I find in the Zoom format, the little teeny tiny face, and my slides aren't particularly decorative. They're examples written in an alphabet you can't read. So I just thought we'd just go direct and see how this goes. I can see certainly a number of you, if it goes too fast or if you want an explanation, if you could do whatever somebody's monitoring or moderating or raising your hand or whatever, or do something drastic, and I'll try and slow down and fill in a little more information. So as far as I can remember in my academic and professional life, I've translated. I've been a translator for Berlitz, for the US Census Bureau, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, for the Library of Congress, writing reports under security clearance on the edges of US intelligence. But I never thought of myself as a translator. I am a linguist who loves literature, and I'm a reader of books who loves language. My career as a Slavic linguist began in the 1970s when Roman Jakobson's structuralism was taught, and linguistics, literature, and poetics were closely aligned fields. This made great sense to me because as an undergraduate, I had triple majored in, what had I triple majored in? Comparative literature, Russian, and linguistics. My master's thesis was based on the Macedonian folklorist Kirill Penushlisky's 300-page unpublished collection of erotic folktales, which I translated and then analyzed for the use of Turkisms and dialectisms. It's important to mention that when I translated 300 pages in Macedonian dialect, I had never studied the language. And the only available dictionary for Macedonian had glosses in the language that was called Serbo-Croatian in the former Yugoslavia. And then I would move from a Serbo-Croatian dictionary into English, and I had a set of dialect texts, which I could then work backwards linguistically to figure out what the word would be in a dialect and find the dialect gloss. So in that period, you can see why so little was translated from these smaller Slavic languages. During the first decade of my linguistic professional life, I researched contextually conditioned uses of certain types of verbs in Balkan languages, with a special emphasis on Macedonian and Bulgarian, though I also studied Russian, Turkish, and Albanian. When the wars of separation, however, broke out in Yugoslavia in the 1990s, my interest in the arcaneness of grammatical categories gave way to an interest in anthropological linguistics and the sociolinguistics of spoken language, standard language, and the language politics of identity, as I tried to understand the association of language and violence and the role that linguists had played in dialect discrimination, politically motivated language restructuring, and the linguistic features that became salient as new shibboleths divided language communities. I had been prepared to study language variation, language and identity, and translation through my training in structural linguistics, with its focus, as Linda noted, on contextually derived meaning. In 2000, when I returned to Skopje after conducting field research for the first time in a small Macedonian village in southern Albania, I learned of the Balkan saga, which were novel memoirs being written by Albanian, Macedonian, French language and comparative literature scholar Luan Starova. Because my academic interests grew out of comparative Balkan linguistics, I was drawn to the border-crossing language and identities of Starova's work. In Vienna, en route home from Skopje, I sat in a pizzeria reading the first in the series, Starova's My Father's Books. Vienna faded away, and I thought if I were ever going to translate anything, I was going to begin with Starova's My Father's Books. So here is an excerpt from near the beginning of that first novel. In the center of the large windowless wall of the living room, the room that actually adjoined the balcony, there was a two-winged wooden cabinet which evoked for us children the unfailing illusion of a world beyond, on the other side of the wall, in the balcony cabinet. That cabinet was rarely opened, and therefore it, more than anything else, sparked our childhood curiosity. It was always locked up tight with its own lock and a separate padlock. One morning, when my mother had gone to the market and my brothers had gone off in various directions, either to school or out with friends, I remained at home alone, absolutely alone. Naturally, my eyes drifted to the cabinet. I noticed that for the first time, the key was still in the lock. I was overcome with excitement. I turned the key. Our family Babel was opened. It was as if I had entered into the realm of some forbidden dream. The little boy enters the cabinet and destroys his father's valuable papers, pulling the stamps off of old deeds, lifting photos off of identity papers, tearing illustrations out of rare encyclopedias. That childhood experience, though, of seeing stamps of different eras, different alphabets, led the grown Starova to enter into the tangled labyrinth of his family's Balkan languages and identities. He explores how diverse peoples cooperated through difficult times, subsistence living, the experience of numerous wars, the institution of new borders, and the reifying of new ethno-national identities in the wake of the Ottoman Empire. Unlike other works written about the Balkans, Starova emphasizes the features, linguistic, cultural, and historical, that bind people of the region together. My translations of his three novels grew out of my interest in pushing back against and amplifying alternative voices to Balkan violence and the trope of Balkan inherited violence. Starova's first two novel memoirs, My Father's Books and The Time of the Goats, were my literary translation apprenticeship. I was fortunate in this apprenticeship because I was mentored by Madeleine Levine, award-winning prose translator of Czesław Miłosz and Bruno Schulz. From Madeleine, I began to learn the difference between the functional translation work I had done before, which was focused on rendering in clear English and directly as possible meaning from one language to another. It was from Madeleine that I first learned to think of translation as performance, as a creative act of interpretation. I also learned from Madeleine that there were new techniques for translating, unlike my years as an MA student, due to the expansion of online sources of all kinds. Roman Jakobson spoke about three different kinds of translation. He spoke about intralingual translation, or rewording, that is, the interpretation of verbal signs by other signs in the same language. Interlingual, or translation proper, which is the interpretation of signs by means of some other language, and intersemiotic translation, or transmutation, signs with nonverbal sign systems. And I apologize about my flickering camera. It's just my brain, I think, going. Now, the translator's toolkit actually employs all three of these. At my desk are single language dictionaries, Macedonian, the kind of dictionary that we often have recourse to. When we look words up, we are getting an intralingual translation. We are getting a rewording of the sign. Dual language dictionaries, both paper versions and online, that translate words into English are, in Jakobson's terms, interlingual. That is, they are translation proper. But intersemiotic translation plays more and more a role in the toolkit of the translator through the gift of image search software, botanical items, clothing, architectural features, food items. These images provide a remarkable tool for the translator. Madeleine, reading my first translation, objected to my describing the library storage in the segment above as a cupboard, which is the standard translation of the Turkish word dolap. Madeleine, who at this point was close to 80, opens her computer up and says, "Let's look at images." And she starts scrolling through images of cupboards and cabinets. There, she says, "What you have is a cabinet. It's a word that can also mean a study, It's something large, it's wooden typically, it's something, it's old, and it's something you can step into. This opened up for me an incredible tool for the minutiae of literary translation. To return to Luan, his writing style is a strange combination of simple words and naive sentence style mixed with serpentine, philosophical, and at times repetitious sentences. His interest in French literature, the influence of Proust, here intermingles with village Macedonian, Albanian, and a nostalgia for the shared Ottoman lexicon. So how in my text do I translate these dialectisms, anglicisms, Frenchisms, archaisms, wordplay? In translating Starova's work, I had to learn to accept the complex intermingling, at times mashup of styles. One aspect of this that I can explain, I think, very clearly is the treatment of Turkisms in his novels and in the other novels I have translated. Turkish words entered all the Balkan languages. When I say the Balkan languages, I mean languages that are typologically related to one another and not in the same language family. So the South Slavic languages, Serbian, Bulgarian, and Macedonian, the Indic language Romani, which is close to Hindi, Albanian and Greek, which are their own isolates from Indo-European, Romanian, which is Romance, and Turkish, which is Finno-Ugric, is Altaic. So for centuries, Turkish was the language of urban elites in the Ottoman Empire. As the Ottoman Empire receded and linguistic nationalism took hold in the newly independent Balkan states, many Turkisms were purged from dictionaries due to language purist movements. And little by little, hundreds of words that had been high style became the vocabulary of colloquial speech or dropped to registers deemed archaic, historical, or obsolete. Macedonian of all the Balkan languages has best preserved this layer of Turco-Persian Arabic vocabulary, unlike, say, in Turkey, where apparently it is considered controversial and politically motivated to draw on this historic layer of Ottoman vocabulary. The shift from the 19th to 20th century Balkans is captured in the language layers in Starova's works. I worked on my translations of these two novel memoirs for 5 years before they were published. That was my apprenticeship. In December of 2010, I received an email from John Siciliano, an editor at Penguin Books. Michael Henry Heim, brilliant translator of Kundera and numerous others, had suggested me to him. Securing the translation of Gota Smilevski's EU prize-winning Freud's Sister was a significant turn for me in the way I translated, what I translated, and why I translated. Gota Smilevski was the first Macedonian writer to win the EU Prize for Literature. To understand the importance of this, I should take a step aside to mention that due to Macedonia's late emergence from the Ottoman Empire in 1912, the Macedonian language was, as Linda noted, not standardized until 1944. The language has been attacked by Serbia as being merely a South Serbian dialect, by Bulgaria as being a Bulgarian dialect, and Greece has referred in the past to the Macedonian language as the Skopjean dialect, named after the capital city, with no written form, grammar, or syntax. To translate from Macedonian then became a political act of recognizing the independence of the literary language. Annie Brisset writes about the publication of books where it states translated into or from Quebecois as an act of reclaiming, recentering identity. I translate from Macedonian in part to recognize the independence of the language and the authors who write in it, and to bring Macedonian authors into broader conversation with other 21st century novels. So we're now going to turn to the nuts and bolts of my work as a translator. The first work I read on the stages of translation, and Linda may recall this back in 2007, was Robert Bly's The 8 Stages of Translation. His 8 stages had to do with sorting out meaning, grammatical structures, linguistic variety, tone, sound. Then you work with a native speaker. Then you check your work, you compare against the original, and off you go. These became, through my own practice, a slightly modified 8. The first is what I call my transpose stage. And this literally is a data dump. I'm a fast typer and a fast reader. So I'm just reading a novel. and I'm reading the novel for the first time. And as I'm reading, I'm typing as I read. And I don't care about syntax. I don't care about vocabulary. Translation is actually so hard and boring in the beginning that I don't really want to know how the novel comes out. This is what forces me to read the novel. So I'm reading my data dump. And if I don't know a word, I just mark XX so I can find my place in the text. If a word has a whole string of words that come to mind, I just run the whole string and I just keep going. That is my transpose stage. My next stages are the translation stage. I go back through, I fix the English syntax, I solve those lexical problems as much as I can, I make choices. And I produce here in these stages what I would call the first reading translation, English translation of the novel. I then, in my next stages, hope to transcend producing something of literary merit that reflects, probably doesn't equal, but at least reflects the literary merit of the original. So here I read for continuity, I consider rhythm and sound, I verify my work with the native speaker. Most of the work I have done is with living authors, and I write back and forth with them. I check against the original for accuracy. Then I reread and I polish. And then the stage that Madeline taught me, then you reread and you polish. And then you reread and you polish. And then you reread and you polish. And then the day comes when the editor says, I'm sorry, you've run out of time. And then off it goes, and you just never look at it again. Because as soon as you open the book, you go, oh my God, what was I possibly thinking? So to explain the process of what's going on here, I need to tell you a little bit about Macedonian. Macedonian is a South Slavic language. Slavic languages are divided into three groups. The South Slavic group are the languages that were the former Serbo-Croatian, so Slovenian, Serbian, Croatian, Bosnian, Montenegrin, Bulgarian, and Macedonian. It's most closely related to Bulgarian and South Serbian dialects. It is a member, as I said, of this Balkan linguistic area, the Balkan Sprachbund, and it shares many linguistic features and lexicon with the Balkan languages. It is, again, as Linda mentioned, it's the base of the oldest written Slavic language, Old Church Slavonic, but the one that was newly codified in 1944. In some ways, as a Slavic language, if any of you hear my talking, you go, oh my God, I really want to learn a Slavic language. Macedonian is the language for English speakers. In many ways, it is the most similar in English to syntax, in terms of syntax, phonology, much more similar than Russian. And yet, Macedonian, where it even looks like English, sometimes they're false friends. So it has case, its only relic in case is in the pronoun system, like in English. We don't have case anymore like German, but we have I, me, he, her, so forth and so on, who, whom, for those of you who still make that distinction. It has perfects and pluperfects, weird for a Slavic language. I have read, I had read, I will have read, I will have had read. Macedonian does those things. And it has a definite article. It doesn't have an indefinite article. You can't say a book, you just say book or one book. But it has the book, but the is attached to the end of the first word in the noun phrase. And it has a future tense that's based on a modal based on want, an invariant form like English has will, Macedonian has something based on want. But even where it's like English, it's unlike English. So in the case system, it has a little relic short form adjective where in English, if we want to invert word order, we have to say something like, Maria loves Ivan. It's Ivan that Maria loves. So if we want to move that noun up to the front, we have to change the syntax. Macedonian just throws in this little pronoun marker. It would be something like, Maria, him, loves Ivan, and Ivan, him, loves Maria. And we still know it's Maria who's doing the loving. I've taught Macedonian for 30 years, and my English-speaking Macedonian heritage students couldn't figure it out. Even where it has the complex verb system complicated like English, it has some categories and does some stuff that English doesn't do. And it has to be solved lexically. For example, it has an L form of the verb, which looks like a past tense, but it can work as a non-confirmative. And what this means is if I say he was in Bitola, I can use a form which says I vouch for the truth value, or I can use a form which says it's hearsay, I can't vouch for the truth value. So He beshe in Bitola, he bil in Bitola. Both of those mean in English he was in Bitola. And the translator has to figure out how much information do you need. That L form can also do what's called an adverbitive, something like, you're from Toronto, but I throw that past tense form there. It's like, you're from Toronto, huh? Who knew? We can't do that in English with a verb form. We have to come up with other lexical ways to do it. Even where English and Macedonian have the same grammatical category, like definiteness and possession, they function differently. English tends to make possession explicit. She got her keys and locked her door. In Macedonian, possession tends to be implicit. She got the keys and locked the door. And we assume because the keys are in her hand, it has an inalienable attachment to her. And we know that those are her keys and that's her door because she's touching it. Macedonian has more limited vocabulary than English, surprise, and fewer stylistic registers. And so these young writers are more and more exploiting increasing use of dialectisms, neologisms, Turkisms, and internationalisms. So to understand the work of the translator, you need to imagine the thousands of pages, the hundreds of thousands of choices, and the millions of opportunities to be wrong. So we can't actually give a talk about translation without citing the Italian traduttore, traditore, translator, traitor. So I've been thinking a lot about this, and I think the only thing that translators are traitors to is monolingualism, because translation is all around us. We actually cannot have the humanities, or probably Western civilization as we know it, without the work of translators and translation. Translators may have historically been invisible, but everywhere we look, we depend on translation. There are thousands of ways to be wrong, and by this saying, no way to be right. Whereas I strive to follow Edith Grossman's goal. Edith Grossman, one of the most renowned Spanish to English translators, wrote that her goal is for the reader of the second language of the translation to perceive the text emotionally and artistically in a manner that parallels and corresponds to the aesthetic experience of its first readers. This is the translator's grand ambition. Good translations approach that purpose, and bad translations never leave the starting line. This, as she notes, is achieved through a keen sense of style in both languages, a critical awareness of the emotional impact of words, the social aura that surrounds them, the setting and mood that informs them, and the atmosphere they create. Significantly, the original work becomes the translator's through a series of creative decisions and imaginative acts of criticism. I admit, I personally was shocked when I began translating to realize the contingency of translation. Every sentence can be reworked. Every sentence can be changed. There are so many choices that you wonder how it takes place at all. Now, this seems to fly in the face of Vladimir Nabokov, who believed that, quote, the clumsiest literal translation is 1,000 times more useful than the pretty paraphrase, and that the person wishing to turn a literary masterpiece into another language has only one duty to perform, and this is to reproduce with absolute exactitude the whole text and nothing but the text. But what exactly is the text? Starova is writing in Macedonian, then he's retranslating into Albanian, he's revising his work, and if fidelity is the sole purpose, machine translation would have worked a long time ago. It turns out, word for word, isomorphism and clear mapping of one language onto another isn't so simple. So let me give you some very specific linguistic and lexical issues and how I have solved them. I'm going to focus for the most part on lexicon and style because these are the easiest to demonstrate without any knowledge of Macedonian grammar. Brisset again writes, building on Jakobson, translation is a dual act of communication. It presupposes the existence of two distinct codes, a source language, which in my case is Macedonian, and a target language, which is in my case, English. The fact that the two codes are not isomorphic, we can't trace one onto the other, that creates obstacles for the translative operation. Linguistic questions are the starting point for all thinking about translation. Deficiencies can be identified as lexical or morphosyntactic deficiencies or as problems of polysemy. Words have multiple meanings, and multiple meaning doesn't map on to multiple meaning, as you will see in my last example here. More often, the deficiency in the receiving code is tied to the relation between signs and their users, things reflecting individuality, social position, and the geographical origin of speakers. And I would say the fact that each word, like in the Christmas Carol, is like, I'm sorry, I suddenly forget his name. Each word is dragging along like the chains and the boxes, carrying this trail of stuff. Edward Morley, thank you. There we go. I think I've got the right name now. And not only that, but the translator is carrying, in this case, her own baggage of what she's read, the associations she makes, words that she likes the sound of and words that she doesn't like the sound of, and those influence my choices. Sometimes we make lexical choices because the author has made the word difficult for us in the context of the novel. In the novel A Spare Life by Lydia Dimkovska, it's a novel about two conjoined twins. And there's a moment where the girls, these conjoined twins, hear their father, who's a rather distant, bumbling sort of father, talking in the other room. The family's quite poor. And he's talking to a childhood friend for the first time. And he's pouring the man a rakia. And the father never drinks rakia. And he calls the father a zemyak. The word zemyak is tricky because it means a fellow countryman, someone from your own neighborhood, a close buddy, but it has to be a word that the girls have never heard before, but it's not a word that they don't recognize. So I translated it. I mean, I can't use the word homie. Like, it is exactly homie, but I can't translate this Macedonian novel with the word homie. So I translated as the word pal. Now, pal is interesting because it's etymologically from English Romany. It enters through Romany in England. Romany, of course, is an Indic language, as I mentioned, but Skopje, where the novel takes place, is where the largest settled Roma community in the world is. So it's possible that the word pal would be in the ether. And pal is a word that's kind of old-fashioned. You might recognize pal, hey pal, but these girls would never use it themselves. Another example comes from Freud's Sister. There's by Gotze Smielewski. There's a scene in an asylum where this poor man Max is having he's in for a breakdown, and he and this young woman start a very tentative, romantic, if you will, friendship. And the brothers are so upset that this young woman, that their sister, is caught the eyes of this young man, that they come and they drag her away from the asylum. And in this moment, Max vocalizes. So then we heard Max, did he howl or did he wail? Well, for me, Max howling, I don't know about you, but all I hear in my brain is the night Max wore his wolf suit and made mischief of one kind or another. And all I hear Max howling is Max swinging with the wild things in his wolf suit. But if I translated this Max's wail, to me, I hear in the distant recesses of my mind, as air beneath a waning moon was haunted by woman wailing for her demon lover. So I get Max wailing in Coleridge's Xanadu, and I'm stealing his image, but to me, it resonates with that heartfelt feeling that Max has. In another example from Freud's Sister, I'm translating along, tick, 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 and it filled him with fear and loathing. No, we can't bring in the gonzo journalist. It can't be fear and loathing. It's going to have to be fear and hatred. Sometimes words are just weird because they're unusual. In the most recent book I translated, Fear of Barbarians, these people are going to a plane, and there's been a plane wreck, and they're pulling out, it's a Second World War pilot, and they're pulling stuff out of the plane. And there's a word, Shatorska krila. It means tent wing. I don't know, maybe some of you know what tent wing is. It has no resonance to me. I have no idea what it means. I spend a long time, John, thank you, you're laughing. Means nothing to me. I finally discover it's German Zeitbahn. Perfect. It's the last word in the novel that gets translated before the book goes to press, when the wonderful editor, Jennifer Barkley, comes up with the word tarpaulin. And because the word appears in two different forms in the novel, I get to have tarp and tarpaulin. So a lovely solution, and it also points to the wonderful contribution that editors make. We're really not working alone as translators. One other example from my father's books, and then I have other examples, but I won't give them to you. Rakia and meze. Fortunately, both of those words are now in the Oxford English Dictionary, so I can translate them into English without italics as raka and meze. Because I'm sorry, if I translate these as brandy and hors d'oeuvres, I am so not in the Balkans anymore. We have just, talk about mood killer. It's just wrong. Other problems are this notion of polysemousness. So the word dom related to domesticity, it's the Russian word for house. But in Macedonian, it can also mean a building, and specifically an apartment building. So if I learn that somebody lives in a dom downtown, I don't know if they're in an apartment or if they're in a house. Fortunately, Google Maps, and Goetze had used a real address. I'm zooming in on Street View to determine in Vienna, is this an apartment or is this a house? The word park seems like a no-brainer, and the sleeping mind of the translator can just skip across park. Oh, I know the word park, it means park. But the asylum is set in a park. We don't have hospitals in parks. We have hospitals on grounds. And you have to get your brain to slow down and sort out where it's being lied to, where that other language is tripping you up. So then we get to our big problem of foreignizing or domesticating. Antoine Berman, whose work was brought to the fore by theorist Lawrence Venuti, wrote that literary prose collects, it reassembles and intermingles the polylingual space of a community. It mobilizes and activates the totality of languages that coexist in any language. A novel is shapelessness, an enormous brew of languages and linguistic systems that operate in the work. How to capture that shapeless polylogic system and avoid arbitrary homogenization. Berman then introduces a number of deforming forces. For example, shortening sentences, rearranging syntax, clarification, where you tend to impose the definite over the indefinite, expansion, translations tend to be longer than the original, unfolding what in the original is folded, the ennoblement or rewriting or prettifying, qualitative impoverishment, lexical loss, the destruction of the vernacular network or their exoticization. I'm coming clean here. I am guilty of a lot of these. But moving from Macedonian into English, there's no way not to change the syntax. There is no way to deal with the non-confirmative without occasionally putting in a purportedly or a supposedly. In English, maybe if you're doing the 50th translation of War and Peace and people are curious to see what you've done, you have a little more license. I am translating unheard novelists that no one has heard of. Their works are probably going to get one translation and one chance to be read by an English-speaking audience. If there is a sentence that goes on for 7 pages combined by a comma splices, no one's going to read it. And so I have to, on occasion, break the long sentences, but keep it enough long sentences so you know it's part of the style, but not enough so that the English reader gives up. Lydia Dimkovska's novel is about 500 pages, and I think the book in total has maybe 50 paragraphs. The book goes on and on and on and on, block page, block page, block page with no paragraphs. With Lydia's permission, I did introduce some paragraphs, not a lot. but some. No English editor would have brought that book to press with no paragraphs. Even so, people complain there aren't enough paragraphs. One easy way for the foreign to come into the novel is through the use, for example, of Turkisms and foreignisms. To give two examples, I wanted to keep the word kelesh. A kelesh, I don't know if you've seen pictures of Albanian men with a white felt cap. In Macedonian, that's called a kelesh. And these girls are looking out, and it's a very unusual Macedonian novel because the girls see the Albanians, they see the Romes, they're trying to come to terms with the mix of nationalities around them. Lydia refused. There's no way that can be a kelesh. You're exoticizing and foreignizing. So in the translation, it's a white felt cap. I was very heartened when I read Maureen Freely writing about her translation of Snow, and Orhan Pamuk considered her use of Turkisms like burek rather than cheese pie as ethnic and folkloric. My arguments with Two Lines Press over other misinterpretations of cultural norms got to be pretty heated. The girls live in an entryway. The press wanted it to be the people coming to the entry of, or to the foyer of the apartment building, and for there to be hallways. Macedonian buildings, apartment buildings do not have foyers. They have stairwells, and you come into the specific entryway, that's that stairwell, and there are apartments up on each landing. My editor kept arguing vociferously as if somehow Macedonia should be transmogrified into Manhattan. It's an entryway. In morphology, I'll just give you one example. With these crazy L forms, in Fear of Barbarians, two women are telling stories in alternate chapters, and embedded in their stories are other stories that other people are telling. Stories that they're telling, the women are telling, the men are telling, and the men are telling stories that other women are telling. But we know through the use of shifting back and forth, using the non-confirmative or not the non-confirmative, which in the embedded text the re-narrator affirms the positive truth value to or not. We have to impose as translator an occasional nod to single that this is a problem. With rhythm and rhyme, just two short examples, and then I'm going to end, if you'll bear with me, with my poetry project that I think is a little exciting, and I'd like to get there. So these are two lines from Freud's Sister, where I think, again, it exemplifies what we are as readers of English literature and how that somehow forces our hand when we're translating. I had translated this line, Adolfina, Freud's sister, says, "I took the little bonnet and I lay down on the bed. I looked at the frayed threads for a long time. I looked at the eaten fabric and fell asleep." I don't know, that kind of tickled my brain, and I changed it. So the final version reads, "I picked up the little bonnet. I got into bed. For a long time, I looked at the frayed threads. I looked at the moth-eaten fabric, and then I slept." What triggered in my mind was the last line of Dylan Thomas's A Child's Christmas in Wales. I turned the gas down. I got into bed. I said some words to the close and holy darkness, and then I slept. My translation has to live as an English language work of art. When Adolfina says, "Had I not despaired as a child, Reiner's unfaithfulness would have been only a short-lived pain, something on which I could have turned my back and moved on." I sneaked in the then. I could have turned my back and then moved on, because somehow Sandberg's cat on little feet crept into my brain, and that then moved on seemed to give it a cadence that matched the beautiful prose that Smilevsky is writing. So if everyone is game, I'd like to just take you down one last pathway, which is to talk about, we all have had terrible losses during COVID. And We've had phenomenal restrictions on what we can do, but I also had some unusual gifts that came to me in COVID. One was the gift of Fear of Barbarians by Petr Andonovsky. The novel came to me just as lockdown. I was asked by Parthian Books to translate it. The other was a phone call from Yasmina Shopova, who is the daughter, probably about my age, of Macedonia's most important one of the two Macedonian most important modernist poets of the last century. Her father, Atso Shopov, died young. He was about 60. And I actually remember the first time I heard the name Shopov, I was on my Fulbright and I went to work at the Institute and no one was there. And I was told that Shopov had died and I didn't know who he was. So Yasmina Shopova calls me up. We arrange a Zoom talk. And she asks if I would translate her father's poetry for the 100-year centennial of his birth in 2023. And I have to tell her, I can't translate poetry. I wish I could, I can't. But I give her some names of people. And one of the people I suggest is Raleigh Graw, whom I knew over 30 years ago when he was a PhD student when I first arrived at U of T. Raleigh and I have been in touch through the years, and Raleigh is a brilliant translator of Russian and Slovenian. His translations of Baratinsky won a major US award last year. He just won he lives now in Slovenia. He just won their highest translator award. So I thought that Raleigh could do this. He'd figure out the Macedonian. Well, Yasmina, kind of like Linda, dragging you into things that you said you actually weren't going to do. Yasmina said, the two of you know one another. You could be the dream team. So Raleigh and I, after knowing each other in this distant way for over 30 years, have begun over email to translate between 50 and 70 poems of Atso Shopov. We've done I think we're up to about 14. So I'm going to talk you through the title of one poem, and then I'm going to end by reading you the poem. So Raleigh and I are both experienced translators, but we do different things. I know Macedonian language and culture. Raleigh is well-versed in the study and translation of poetry. So what we do is I type out the Macedonian and I mark all the stressed syllables for him. Then that's stage one. Then I give him an interlinear translation in English where I tell him what a word means. I might give a series of definitions. I put stylistically, is it poetic? Is it obsolete? Is it a dialect word? Is it an archaic word? I give him morphologic information. This is that non-confirmative verb form, or this is a perfect, or this is a whatever. And then I produce what I think is kind of a first translation. It's terrible. I produce something that looks like a poem verse translation of this. And then it's like I've brought the coal truck and I drop this coal bin through Raleigh's chute. And then through some alchemy, he turns it into gold. And then we go back and forth and we polish it together. So it's really been a very lovely thing. So the title of the poem I'm going to tell you about has 4 words in the title: Bela Taga na Izvorot. Those 4 words kept Raleigh and me and Yasmina communicating back and forth for 7 months. So I want to tell you a little bit about what was involved in that discussion of the title, and then you can extrapolate to the whole poem, and then I'll read you the whole poem. So the word izvor, which is in its definite form, izvorot, the word izvor, I hate it. It means source, but of anything. And it means water spring, it means wellspring, it means font, it means all those things. In English, source and spring are problematic because they both have multiple meanings that they don't have in Macedonian. So my opening salvo to Raleigh was, how about the white sorrow of the water spring? It's not great, but the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, gives water spring as its own entry, and we might want to consider it. I hate that word izvor because of its double meaning. Raleigh writes back proposing the white ache of the source. Now, I like each of those words separately. I like ache, I like source, but the white ache of the source, I'm sorry, I think it sounds weird. I suggest we get rid of the definite article, like heartache, whiteache. Raleigh writes back, maybe we should have spring in the title, but wellspring in the third to last line and connect the seasonal change. By October 10th, Raleigh is back in Team Source, telling me that he likes Source because it's the least poetic choice, and he believes that part of what this poem is about is moving away from traditional poetry to a more modern understanding, including the doubt and uncertainty and concreteness and rejection of sentimentality. We have a lot more exchanges that I will not bore you with right now. In May, after 7 months of this, I write back, I'm waffling again on Source and spring. Raleigh writes back, okay, it's time to go back to the source, i.e. the poem, and let's see how spring really works. And he says, I'm having second thoughts about ache. He had settled on it because of its cousinhood, if you will, with the Russian word toska, which is notoriously difficult to translate. I think Nabokov has a whole essay about it. He's written quite eloquently about it. Toska is longing, yearning, sorrow, ache. Portuguese saudade. It's all those things. But then Raleigh began looking at more contexts of taga, and it can mean all those things, but it's also your bread and butter word for sorrow, sadness, and all these things. So he proposes the white sorrow of the spring. I reread it. I agree. I tell him, I think spring with white sorrow is an unexpected image. It kinds of a flip of Houseman's cheery cherry trees. But then we realize it's not the season, but the start of the rivers. Yasmina, who thought the poem was long since fully translated, writes back, your changes are excellent, and it shows in the title itself. Bella Tataga Naizvorot, the white sorrow and the spring, make them, for me, more nostalgic and less a romantic atmosphere of the song, the poem, than ache and source. So that's one word. So if I may, I'd like to end by reading you this lyric poem by Atsa Shopov, translated by Raleigh Graw and me. When we get to the word hunched, if you want another talk on hunched, we can do another thing about how we got to that word. The white sorrow of the spring. I left you, song of old, song of innocence, left without regret. For the white sorrow of the wellspring I left, for the inconstant love of the rivers, for a lump of sky, the blueness of coal, for the unreachable things, the most distant things. I left you, song of old, song of innocence, left without regret. And now a weight of uncertainty sits hunched on the doorstep of the morning, repeating the same question over and over. Is there really any value to what you think has value? Because I know everything will fall silent when autumn comes, and when they join with the seas that are theirs, the rivers will find a love that brings them peace, and the sky will grow ripe, made fruitful by the song of the grain and the vines and the olives. Only the white sorrow of the spring will remain, the same as it was, unchanged, like an eternal yearning for distances. Thank you.